Welcome to Jewish Life with Daniel. I am your host, Rabbi Daniel Levine. Today, I am here with the former mayor of Efrat, Oded Revivi. He was the mayor of Efrat for 15 and a half years. Now he is the CEO of the Museum of Jewish Identity. I hope I got the exact name right. Oded, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much. The actual name is Anu, the Museum of the Jewish People.
Got it. Perfect. So I've actually taken students, I told you this offline, to visit Efrat before on various fact-finding trips. Efrat is obviously both a settlement. It's also, an ancient place in Jewish history, probably most famously, just for listeners, from the book of Ruth or the book Megillat Ruth. Efrat is mentioned. It's mentioned a couple other times in Tanakh. It obviously has a very fascinating history through 1948 with 1967. Can you just start off, for somebody that's never heard of Efrat, maybe knows vaguely that it's some city or settlement in Israel, what's sort of the, quick 2-minute history of Efrat and why it's such an important place within Israel?
Well, you started with the biblical connotation. So basically, Efrat is mentioned in two major places in the Bible. One is when Rachel gives birth to Benjamin. She basically dies whilst giving birth on the way to Bethlehem, which is called Ephrata. And the second place is obviously in the book of Ruth, as you mentioned, that Ruth and Boaz play out in the field, the outskirts of Bethlehem. They fall in love, and they're promised that out of that love story will be born the king of Israel, King David. And it says in the book of Ruth that you will prosper in Efrat. So that's the two biblical connotations. And for those of you who don't know where it's actually located, so if you have Jerusalem, south of Jerusalem, you have the city of Bethlehem, and south of the city of Bethlehem, you have the city of Efrat, literally joining one another with absolutely no space in between those three cities. And Efrat was established in 1983 with a vision of the people who set it up, that after 1948, where the Jews who lived in the Etzion block were either killed in battle, taken into the Jordanian captivity, or slaughtered after surrendering. Once we get back to this land, there needs to be a strong Jewish presence in this area. And that's where the vision of building the city came about, that there needs to be a center, which will be a city, which will have schools, which will have kindergartens, shopping centers, everything that you can think of a modern city. That's what we have in Efrat.
Amazing. So we'll get to Bethlehem, questions of the Palestinian settlements, in a couple of minutes. Just to stay on 1948 for a second, obviously most of the listeners listening to this are engaged within, American political context, where a lot of times, in 1948, the conversation tends to trend towards, Nakba, especially on college campuses and everything. One of the interesting things, as you said, of Gush Etzion, which is, just for listeners, Efrat is within the wider area of Gush Etzion. And again, we're talking about, tiny areas. Efrat, I'm sure you know the exact dimensions. I mean, you can walk from one side to the other, in a couple of hours on a Shabbat afternoon. What is the story of what happened in 1948? Because that is a specifically, one of the sadder stories, I think, in terms of the 1948 Independence War.
So prior to 1948, there were Jews who were living in the Etzion block. They were living in four different small towns. And during the days upcoming to the War of Independence, they were under siege. There were different convoys who tried to break through to bring them supplies, to bring them medicine, to bring them food, to bring them ammunition. Some of the convoys actually made it. Some of them were attacked on the way, and the people were killed on the way. But when the War of Independence breaks out, or the day before the declaration of the State of Israel, basically the Arabs attack these four cities, kill some. A few months before, the women and children are evacuated to Jerusalem, to a monastery in Jerusalem, and those who stay are either the unmarried women or the men, and they stay to protect their property. And the days before the Declaration of Independence, there's an attack on these four towns, where some of the people fall in battle. Some of them are being taken to captivity to the Jordanian prison, and some of them are being slaughtered after surrendering. In 1948, when Ben-Gurion declares the independence of the State of Israel, it's a day after the Etzion block literally falls. And he says that if it wouldn't have been up to the bravery of the warriors in the Etzion block, Israel wouldn't have been able to declare independence. And that's the significance of when it happened. The Israeli Memorial Day for the fallen soldiers is the day before the Day of Independence, literally because that's the day when the battle took place in the Etzion block, which was so significant regarding the course of events.
Amazing. So I'm going to hope that my listeners have at least some vague semblance of Israeli history, just in case they don't, just to paint the picture. And then I'll ask you a more pointed question. After 1948, Gush Etzion, along with, the entire current West Bank or Judea and Samaria, I'll ask you about that distinction in a little bit, is under the control of Jordan. And then again, in 1967, when Jordan attacks Israel, Israel subsequently reconquers, reclaims, whatever word we want to use, that land from Jordan, along with obviously the Golan Heights in the north and the Sinai and Gaza in the south from Egypt. What was the significance? Because Gush Etzion, it's interesting because it's a little bit different than the rest of settlements, and you can let me know if you fully agree with me or you don't, because Gush Etzion was a place where there was a huge Jewish community before 1948, as opposed to a lot of other settlements that, obviously Jews in biblical times were living in a lot of places, but most of the modern settlements weren't actually places that had a Jewish community there in sort of the interwar period. So what was the specific significance of Gush Etzion, not just Efrat, but just the wider area being, reclaimed and repopulated by a Jewish community in the last 50 years?
So basically, you spelled it out. The fact that there was a presence of Jewish people on this specific area of land prior to 1948, that makes it slightly more in the consensus. But the truth of the matter is that when we look as to the course of events since 1967 up until today, we learn that there isn't really a consensus about a specific area that you can say gets some sort of discount, not being claimed by the Palestinians being a part of the Palestinian state that they would like to set up. But for us, we say, because there was here a Jewish presence prior to 1948, the status is slightly different.
Yeah, and it seems like any, potential or certainly the past two-state solution proposals, we can talk about that in a few minutes. Efrat and sort of the major Gush Etzion bloc would have been part of, Israel, and there would have been land swaps, somewhere else. Because again, I mean, you probably know the population statistics a lot better than I do, but, it's basically impossible to take Jews out of the current, Etzion bloc area.
Well, basically, if we go and explore any of the attempts to reach a peace agreement, all the different offers that were on the table throughout the history, they offer between 92 to 98% of the land. And when you ask yourself, where do these figures come from? You basically see that the actual footprint, the actual land which is being occupied by Jews in Judea and Samaria amounts to about 1.6%, maybe 2%. And then basically the idea was that with very little border amendments, you could actually reach a peace agreement with leaving all the Jews living where they are and allowing the Palestinians to set their Palestinian state. However, the Palestinians have never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. All these offers were never accepted by the Palestinians, and that's why today we're 57, 58 years after the 1967 war, and basically in a reality where there are more Jews living today in Judea and Samaria, Palestinians are further away from a Palestinian state than they were in the past. Also because of the brutal attack of the 7th of October, which was a major breach of trust for those who actually had some trust in any potential cooperation with the Palestinian people. And that's where we are at the moment.
Yeah, so we'll get to October 7th in a second, because it's actually, the last time I was in Efrat was before October 7th. For, just listeners' disclosure, I have both aunts and uncles and cousins that live in Efrat. So to me, growing up, I would visit Israel, every year. And to me, Efrat was Israel. A lot of people's, vision of Israel is, Tel Aviv and maybe one day in Jerusalem visiting the Western Wall. And then, they've never been over the Green Line, quote unquote. For me, we got off the plane in Ben Gurion and took a taxi, right to Efrat. Which is why, you told me you commute to Tel Aviv, which is why I asked you about that, because I know how bad traffic could be there to go to work. There's sort of a couple different stages in history, that I want to paint. One of the interesting things is when you talk to people that were in, say, the Efrat area before the first Intifada. So now we're talking about, or the Gush Etzion area, not Efrat, the 1970s and the 1980s. there was a lot more, interplay between, you said Beit Lechem, and, I've spent many Shabbatot in Efrat. I mean, you look down the hill and there's Bethlehem. I mean, it's, less than a mile away in some areas. There used to be a lot more intermingling between those different groups. People would go to Bethlehem to the open markets, and, if they needed something repaired on their car, all the way to, just a nice Friday, shopping out. How did the first Intifada, and then we can talk about the second Intifada, how did that start to change it a little bit in terms of just the day-to-day interaction between your average Jew living in Gush Etzion and your average Palestinian living, not just in Beit Lechem, but just, the West Bank writ large?
So I would say we have a short memory. And after the first Intifada, where there were attacks and there were casualties and there were people who were murdered, comes a peaceful period of time where life almost goes back to normal. But the significant historical event that happened after the First Intifada is basically the Oslo Accord. And the Oslo Accord, I would say, instead of having a vision of creating a peace agreement, it basically tried to draw a separation agreement. And it drew a map with areas A, B, and C, drawing a time framework that as time would go by, the Palestinians will get more and more areas of land until they would get the whole area and it will become a Palestinian state. Because of the course of events, because of the lack of trust, because of rounds of violence, this never accumulates into a Palestinian state. And I remember Prime Minister Rabin saying that we have to battle the Intifada as if there is no peace agreement, and we have to continue with the peace agreement as if there's no Intifada. But that's very easy to say on a philosophical argument. But when you have casualties and when you bury your relatives and when there are attacks on a daily basis, you can't really carry on doing a peace agreement with those who actually kill you on a daily basis. And that's where the big difference happened. And the shift of mind that we're going into a process of separation. But the process of separation stopped. And then we come to the second Intifada. And then there are again casualties and people being killed and people being murdered and a lot of lack of sense of security. And after Israel's security forces do whatever they do, we retain the quiet, the peaceful arrangement, I would say all the way up until the 7th of October, obviously with some incidents of terror attack and also with throwing rocks and Molotov cocktails, but it wasn't on a such high level as it was during the terms of the first Intifada and the second Intifada. The 7th of October is a big earthquake in Israel. When we see the pictures, when we hear the witnesses, when we understand the impact and brutality of the attack that took place on the 7th of October, many people have shifted from a belief, a understanding, a wish that we can actually trust the Arabs and reach a peace agreement. There becomes way less ability to trust them, to think of something which can lead to a peace agreement. And if you would come to Israel today, you would find a much more skeptical population than what there was prior to the 7th of October.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I've personally been to Israel twice since October 7th. I just never had a chance to make it out to Efrat because they were both on, trips with American Jewish leaders. And I certainly, what you're saying rings true. The last time I talked to you, you don't remember this, but I do, was 5.5 years ago over the summer. Just to give listeners, I brought a group of non-Jewish student leaders, and, we were doing this fact-finding trip throughout Israel, and we visited, I believe, your home in Efrat. And I remember you dispelled a lot of stereotypes. I remember you were one of the more, controversial people, on really all sides, because, one, when we told people we were going to meet a, mayor who's the mayor of a settlement, people expected you to come out, this right-wing firebrand, guns blazing, so ideological that nobody could talk to you. The second thing that actually made a mark that I remember, and, I certainly know this just from being a tourist visiting Efrat, but even today, or I guess pre-October 7th, and I'll ask you if that changed post-October 7th, a lot of people from, Bethlehem and other Palestinian villages actually come into work, right? There's a big Rami Levy in Gush Etzion, the Israeli equivalent to Walmart, it's still a little bit smaller, but, just this massive supermarket that, again, had both Israelis and Palestinian workers working in it. And, oftentimes in America, we have these, black and white views of, okay, the settlements are, the far right-wing people and they hate Palestinians and Palestinians hate settlements. But actually on the ground, you go visit a shopping center in Gush Etzion and what you see actually really dispels that stereotype in a lot of ways. So one, I just wanted to highlight that. If you want to, respond to that, you can, but how did October 7th change that? I mean, if I went to a Rami Levy today in Gush Etzion, am I still seeing Palestinian workers? Has just the skepticism gone so high that it's just impossible now? And so what is sort of that shift?
So if you would have come to Efrat on the 5th of October, 2 days before the 7th of October, we had in my house the annual gathering which took place during the festival of Sukkot, where we had Palestinian leaders, Israeli army officers, Israeli police officers, and residents of Efrat. Basically just socializing and talking about day-to-day basis. And the major topic of discussion on the 5th of October in my house was, when is the general going to pay a visit to the Palestinian village? Because there was absolutely no foresight of what was going to happen 48 hours later. 48 hours later, as I said, a big earthquake. Something that nobody had anticipated, nobody was prepared for, and the blood price is extremely high and heavy, and we still haven't finished paying the price. We had today a funeral of 5 soldiers who fell in battle in Gaza. As we speak, there is a big question mark if there are going to be hostages released within the next few weeks or not, because Hamas is basically draining any piece of humanity or sanity that we have within Israel about our desire to see the hostages back, but they're not even allowing us to know who is alive and who is dead. And the 7th of October definitely influenced the whole of the state of Israel. Up until today, from the 7th of October, Palestinian workers are not allowed to go into Israel to work. Within Judea and Samaria, there are some places that Palestinian workers can come back to work, some places they can't. You asked about Rami Levy, the shopping center. So Rami Levy, the supermarket, the shopping center, you used to be able to see there Jews and Arabs shopping simultaneously, walking up and down the same aisles, and you would come and see that the cashier could be a Jewish girl or an Arab boy, and they were working one besides the other. Today, you will find there are some Palestinian workers. You won't find any Palestinian shoppers because the level of fear, because the risk of things deteriorating security-wise, they're not allowed to go in, which definitely change the whole atmosphere and the whole vibe of what's happening there.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And, just I guess to zoom out just for listeners, one of the interesting things about talking to you, and I don't actually know your politics in terms of Israel, so maybe we can get into that if you feel comfortable, but just an observation is the trends for listeners, this is a generalization, is, people who live in Tel Aviv tend to be more left and liberal. People who live in Judea and Samaria tend to be more right-wing, right? That's a generalization. I'm sure you can find, the right-winger in a Tel Aviv cafe and the left-winger in Efrat. But the interesting thing is actually people in Efrat tend to actually know Palestinians on an individual basis a lot more than people in Tel Aviv, right? You walk through Tel Aviv and you go to a cafe and you're almost never going to be served by a Palestinian. You're not going to be sitting next to a Palestinian. Your coworkers are all going to be Israeli versus you, who, again, you're the mayor of a settlement, which, just for American listeners who are viewing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through Western media, again, the settlements have the stereotype of being these sort of anti-Arab, black and white ideologues, and yet you're actually sitting down, inviting into your house. You mentioned on Sukkot on October 5th, Palestinian leaders in the West Bank. I mean, what are those relationships like? And, how has that, you can talk about either pre-October 7th or post. I mean, has that given you any hope for, something to be solved? I mean, what does it mean to actually know people on an individual level as opposed to, in America when everyone just, everyone's, grouped into into an identity. So there's, the Palestinians, and then there's the settlers, and then there's, the liberals in Tel Aviv that are marching against Bibi. So what does that mean on a individual level? How has that tailored your politics?
So, I mean, it's hard, or maybe it's easy to fall into the equations of generalizing. I think what led me in my behavior, in my attitude, was the realization that at the end of the day, these people are our neighbors. And as we don't want to be considered being potentially kicked out of our houses because of whatever agreement or whatever process, I don't think that they would like to be kicked out of their houses. And because I don't see them going anywhere and us going anywhere, I thought that the best way to secure the future is to try and get to know them and have some sort of connection on a personal basis. Generally speaking, it worked. Generally speaking, it proved itself. Does everybody agree with it? Obviously not. After the 7th of October, people became way more skeptical whether there is a hope for that interaction. I personally can say that it was a bit frustrating in two aspects. Number one, that all this engagement always had to take place like thieves at night. We could never report it. We could never tell people about it. We could never share pictures about it. The first time we had the gathering in my sukkah, the Palestinians were so excited to see an Israeli general in full guard that they were standing in line to take selfies with the general. And after they took the selfies, they put it up on social media. And the following day, they get arrested by the Palestinian Authority under the accusation of negotiating peace with the Zionist enemy without being authorized to do so. Now, they didn't negotiate any peace agreements. It was a social gathering, but the Palestinian Authority couldn't uphold a picture of a Palestinian hugging an Israeli general and smiling, because that's against the Palestinian narrative. And there are definitely today innocent Palestinians who would like to see a peaceful relationship. Unfortunately, the acts of the extremists were so brutal, were so painful, that it will take now a very long period of time until people will heal from that attack and will be able to consider something more substantial. My personal relations with these Palestinians was ongoing since the 7th of October. Obviously, I couldn't host them. I couldn't go and visit them. We talked occasionally on phone. I could say that I was slightly upset that they weren't more forthcoming with condemning the attack that took place in the Gaza Strip. But I can also understand that they are under a lot of pressure. The Palestinian Authority explores and follows them as to what they say and what are their views, and they're in a difficult position.
So I'm going to guess, just, due to your current job and also the fact that you speak fluent English, is that a South African accent, by the way, that I'm...
No, I was born in Israel. I did my law degree in England. I'm married to a Brit, but everybody has different guesses as
Got
to
it.
where my accent is from.
Okay. No, I was trying to guess because it sounded a little bit off from British. I would have guessed South African, but I guess it's British. So I'm guessing you've consumed a lot of, Western media, both European and American, over the last year and a half, and probably watched with, the same type of negative amazement that the rest of us have in terms of just the way that a lot of this has been reported. I mean, from your vantage point on the ground, what are the biggest misconceptions that, okay, obviously the people in the encampments that are, anti-Israel, supporting Hamas on college campuses, okay, let's leave them aside. But even just the mainstream American Jewish community that's generally pro-Israel, I work for Hillel on campus. I'm sure you're familiar. What are some of the biggest misconceptions that people in the Jewish community in America have about Israel?
When the first few weeks after the attack of the 7th of October, in order to try and explain to the international community how severe the attack was on the 7th of October, I made a comparison in figures comparing the size of the population of Israel with the size of the population in the United States, the amount of people that were killed on the attack on the 7th of October, and comparing it to 9/11. And basically, the figure that came out was that if at 9/11 we had about 3,000 people killed in the attack on the Twin Towers, so just think if 9/11 there were 30,000 people killed. How would the United States would react if that was the figure? 10 times more. But the actual comparison is that it was almost 20 times more if you compare the size of the population in Israel to the size of the population in the United States. So Israel was attacked with the amount of casualties 20 times more than what the United States was attacked in 9/11. The United States after 9/11, we all know what they did. They declared war, they went after specific individuals, but look what happened to something that we were all used to do beforehand, taking airplanes. If you wanted to board an airplane prior to 9/11 in the United States, you could come and pay in cash on the desk. Nobody asked you what's your name. Nobody asked you to show your identity card. Definitely nobody asked you to go through security measurements like they do today. The whole transport world changed after 9/11. So think if the attack was 20 times more severe, that's what we have suffered in Israel. And therefore, it is something that Israel had to respond to. The response was very difficult because it had to deal with people who attacked us from schools, from hospitals, from kindergartens, taking human beings as their shields because they weren't really standing out like an army saying, yes, let's have a fight. And when those are the terms of the battle, it is a very difficult battle to fight. And having said that, we know for a fact that there are quite a few countries who come to Israel to explore. How did we deal with combating terror groups in Gaza in order to try and learn because of threats that they have where they live? And at the end of the day, war is not a pleasant thing. We Westerners, we explore acts of war under a magnifying glass as if it's been done in a laboratory or in a courthouse, forgetting that the actual conditions in the field are completely different, and forgetting one other thing. We are bound to act according to human rights, according to human values. Those terrorists have absolutely no values. They raped and beheaded women and children in the most brutal acts of violence, which we can't even imagine. So when you have such a comparison of behaviors of two societies, rules don't apply to both sides on the same type of measurement, it's a very difficult battle to fight.
Yeah, my last podcast was with an Israeli political scientist who does research on Israeli whistleblowing. And, it was an interesting podcast just for listeners. At the end, we got into a little bit of a debate about groups like Breaking the Silence, where, she was basically defending them and I was, pushing back. And one of the things that I said was, I have no doubt that a lot of the things that people in Shovrim Shtika or Breaking the Silence say, probably a lot of it's true, but it's just sort of this unfair game of what gets reported because, it's almost laughable to think that in Lebanon or Syria or Iran or Gaza, you would have a group like that. So it just gets so much disproportionate attention because then if the BBC or New York Times is writing an article about, human rights violations, you just have a lot more examples in Israel, not because Israel does it worse. Israel's much better in terms of its record, but just there are a lot more people because Israel is a much more open and free liberal society that actually speak out. So I think it just, skews the way that a lot of people end up seeing it. It's very similar to what you're saying, where just yeah.
Even if you take the United Nations and you see how many times Israel was condemned for things Israel has done, and when we know what has been happening in the Ukraine by the Russians, we know what has been happening in Syria, we know what's happening in Iran, we know what's happening in Yemen. All those countries don't get condemned at all. It's not because they're acting according to a set rules and set values that they're all saints. It's just nothing that's being done there is actually being exposed in these organs, where Israel is almost naked, completely forthcoming with come and see how we're acting, and then we get condemned for the little that we do wrong sometimes.
So when I was talking with, just listeners of the podcast and told them I was going to talk to you, I got sent a lot of questions. So I'll paraphrase, I'll tailor them to make them a little bit more challenging for you, because I know you can handle it. Do you see a difference in your everyday life, or do you know, obviously you intellectually know, but do you feel a difference living over the Green Line versus if you lived in Israel proper? Just to give, just the 10-second background, if people don't know what the Green Line is, pause this podcast and go look it up, but it generally, pre-67, post-67, I mean, does living in a settlement, do you feel that in every day, or does it feel like, you live in any other city?
So let me correct you slightly. The Green Line is actually the line of ceasefire from the War of Independence. It's not even international law. We today apply an international border. We today apply to it as if something which is full in consensus, but the truth of the matter is, going back to the War of Independence, that was the line drawn of the ceasefire, and it has no legal standing if people want to refer it. It is true that as time went by, people say, oh, over the Green Line and beyond the Green Line. But if we just follow what has been happening in the last 15 months, the kibbutzim, the small towns bordering the Gaza Strip, they were attacked in their undisputed territories. If you see what happened yesterday in Israel, I think it was midnight, there were rockets shot from Yemen towards Tel Aviv. That's not a disputed area, right? Nobody thinks that we need to return Tel Aviv. So it is true that the international community treats differently the areas which are over the Green Line, but the truth of the matter is, most of the attacks, most of the terror attacks, most of the casualties actually happened in the non-disputed territories, in places like Tel Aviv, Haifa, Ofakim, Sderot. So if you want to be cynical, you say, oh, that's something which is in dispute, that's why they want that area. But at the end of the day, Prime Minister Netanyahu put it in the most accurate way, that if the Palestinians were willing to have a real peace agreement, we could have already reached a compromise on the borders. The problem is, they don't really want to see any Jewish presence in this region, and that's why the attacks in the last 15 months all took place in places which are not considered occupied territories, disputed territories, over the Green Line. They were all over the center of Israel.
Yeah, I have no doubt that what you're saying, it totally aligns with, what I think. I think, obviously the people screaming from the river to the sea, I think, highlight that point that they're not really seeing a separation. But just to, pin down on this question for a second, there is a big difference, maybe not from, the Houthis in Yemen in terms of figuring out, okay, let's only try to, shoot down, this place and not Haifa and not Tel Aviv because one's over the Green Line and not. But, as you know, but just to paint for listeners, the legal status of Palestinians over the Green Line, let's forget East Jerusalem just for simplicity, a Palestinian in Bethlehem right now does not have, voting rights in Israel, is not treated as an Israeli citizen. They're treated under Israeli military law, not Israeli civil law, whereas, you sitting in Efrat are treated under Israeli civilian law, not military law. So, when a lot of people, and, again, I'm not talking about, the anti-Israel, crazies who can't locate any of this on a map, but people, even within Israel who really understand the borders and the legal differences, just the situation of, obviously there's good historic precedent, there's 48, there's 67, there's a second intifada. So without even getting into all the mess of why the situation is what it is, just the idea that there is a region where there's both Jews and Palestinians living there that are interacting in some, maybe not daily, but some weekly occurrence that are subjected differently to the law. One has the power to vote, one doesn't. For a lot of Westerners, that just rings as fundamentally unfair, even if they could understand, okay, it makes sense why that situation was put into place, but to continue that situation, there must be some way to, to fix that. I'm reminded, I don't know if you're familiar with, Micha Goodman's book, Catch 67, but, because he's very popular in, certain subsets of the American Jewish community. So, his book where he sort of, lays it out just to give the thesis for listeners, he basically argues both the general left and the general right in Israel are both correct. They're just talking about different things, right? The right is correct in terms of security, and I'll throw in also, Jewish historical significance of places. The left is right in terms of, the Palestinians currently under, a different legal system, and that's just not good for the future for anyone. I see you smiling, so I'm going to guess there's some familiarity, hopefully positive, but just to throw that question to you.
So Micha Goodman is a good friend, but he's a philosopher. So he could argue both sides of the aisle and make you feel, oh, here comes somebody who talks some sense. But at the end of the day, leaders, politicians, statesmen, they need to create a policy. Now, Israel foresaw your question. And in 1967, there was some sort of dream, wish, an invention of an equation, which was called land for peace. Basically thinking that those areas of land that we conquered, released, occupied, use whichever politically correct term you want, during the Six-Day War, we will give back in order to get a peace agreement. But then we had a peace agreement with Egypt, and they only wanted the Sinai Desert, they didn't want the Gaza Strip. So they started to jeopardize the equation, and all of a sudden, the occupied territories are unwanted goods by the country who occupied it before. And when we come and have a peace agreement with Jordan, they don't want Judea, Samaria, East Jerusalem, which were all parts of Jordan prior to the Six-Day War, because they don't want any more Palestinians to join the Hashemite kingdom because they're against the king and the king is afraid of an uproar against him. So the Oslo Accord, foreseeing your question, basically determined that the Palestinians living in Judea and Samaria will have voting rights for the Palestinian Authority, for the president, for the prime minister, for the parliament. But here comes the collision between Westerners who believe in democracy and Arab countries who don't always run like a democratic society. And the Palestinian Authority hasn't had elections for over 16 years. Why? Because they're afraid of their results. So Israel actually built a political system that when you ask me where their voting rights, they have voting rights for their elected officials. They don't exercise it because they don't want to. Their authority doesn't believe in it. Now, I can't force on them having democratic elections because I don't want to govern them and I don't want to set the rules as to how they live. But Israel, in order not to jeopardize the Jewish majority, decided that, yes, we're going to go towards a Palestinian state. That was the whole idea behind the Oslo Accord. And that's where they had their voting rights. The fact that something went wrong on the way is undisputable. And that's where we are at the moment. But there are solutions how to resolve it, but you need two for a tango. And at the moment, it seems like there's no partner.
Sure. And, it's funny because I actually reached out to Micha Goodman a couple months ago. He didn't answer. So if you know him, you can, send him this and say that, I'm a big fan of his book. I've recommended it to a bunch of people. Just one more question about, his depiction of this, and I'm curious what you think of this. One of the things he does, I guess like a good Talmudic scholar, is he makes this distinction between, when he says occupation, between people and land, which, I think is very interesting. I don't know if he's the first one to do this, but, just again, to spell it out for listeners, he says, the land's not occupied. It's sort of crazy to think that way because who's Israel occupying it from? As you said before, obviously Judea and Samaria, right? You open up the Tanakh or, the weekly Parshiot, and the whole thing is taking place in, Yehuda v'Shomron, Judah and Samaria. You obviously look at the historic record, okay, it's not the Ottomans because the Ottomans disbanded. It's not really the British because they punted to the UN. Jordan, never actually claimed it. They were sort of occupying it. And it's not like the Palestinians living in the West Bank had, equal rights when Jordan was in control. So, that point is granted. Is there any validity to the idea that the Palestinian people are under some sort of, again, occupation is such a, hot button political terminology, but, it is true generally that all of the things that we value in a democracy, right? The ability to vote, the ability to say, okay, we want a little bit less government surveillance, if that means more freedom, just all these, tensions that are, hopefully present in democracies, Palestinians don't really have in the same way because all of a sudden, if Palestinian Islamic Jihad, has some terror cell in Jenin, all of a sudden, the roads are now closed for the rest of the day. And if you wanted to go visit your uncle for a barbecue, and you're Palestinian, all of a sudden you can't. I mean, do you see that distinction, even separate than any, grand solutions of saying, okay, well, here's exactly how to solve it?
No, I think again, my problem with Micha Goodman's book is that it's too philosophical. It doesn't give you, at the end of the day, a set of tools how to resolve the conflict. And the conflict will only be resolved when you have two parties on both side on either side basically agreeing that we need to start putting our arms down and trying to think of ways how to live peacefully one alongside the other. As long as that doesn't happen, we're in rounds of battle and combat, responding to attacks. It's nothing that we would like to do, but we're basically forced into it. As I said, the 5th of October, there was a very peaceful meeting in my house. Nobody anticipated the 7th of October. After the 7th of October, nobody can imagine that gathering happening again because there's so much breach of trust that when you talk about resolving it, building a mechanism, you need to start, unfortunately, bottom up. After the 7th of October, the bottom has gone even further down to lower bottom, if you can imagine a lower bottom than when we say bottom up. And that's where we are at the moment. And that trust needs to be built. Those relationships need to be built, and declarations. It needs to be done publicly, not being afraid of extremists. And unfortunately, we don't see that at the moment.
None. Okay, three last quick questions, and I'll see if there's any other topic that we didn't get to. You're the CEO of the Museum of the Jewish People. Could you give the brief, what is the mission statement? And, more pointedly, one of the interesting things that I found in talking to, American Jewish students, specifically those that, don't grow up with a robust Jewish identity, have probably, if they've been to Israel, was once on a birthright trip, is a lot of times they see Israel as, this outside political component that, maybe has something to do with their Jewish identity and maybe doesn't. But what would you say to sort of, a 19-year-old American Jew listening to this podcast? They've never been to Israel before. They've spent their entire life on the west coast of California. Judah Halevi famously said, I'm on the uttermost west and thinking about Israel, right? He was in Spain. That's a lot closer than, California. So what would you say to that 19-year-old, if they just said, listen, I'm not anti-Israel. It's just, why should I care about Israel any more than I care about, I don't know, England? My grandparents are from England. So, what's the difference? What would you tell them?
So I think we say history doesn't repeat itself, but there are some resemblance between periods in history. And if we look at the beginning of World War II and what was happening with Nazi Germany, they basically said, we don't really care. How do you define yourself? We don't care if you don't see yourself as a Jew. But according to our records, we can trace down your ancestors and we know that you're a Jew, and that's why we're putting you in that crowd of Jewish people. And I think what we're witnessing after the 7th of October regarding the diaspora, the Jewish community outside of Israel, that all of a sudden they have been pointed and targeted for their Jewish background just because of the levels of anti-Semitism, not because they all of a sudden feel more Jewish. The Diaspora Museum, which was the former name of the ANU, the Museum of the Jewish People, was basically legislated by the government as being the center of all Jewish communities in Israel and the diaspora. And after the 7th of October, we understood that mission even more, and we're investing a lot in trying to help through the educational system, through visits of youngsters into the museum to see how can they identify themselves, affiliate themselves as being more Jewish, more connected to the Jewish people. And that is what we're trying to achieve in the museum itself and also in the outreach programs that we have all over the world.
Yeah, I'm excited to come next time I'm in Israel. It's going to be on my list. Two other questions, more political. You can obviously answer this as an individual or not as your CEO position. You can also dodge accordingly. Obviously, a lot of people in America right now, we're talking on January 14th. We have less than a week until Donald Trump takes over. He's obviously talking a very big game in terms of what he's going to do in terms of solving the current, Israeli, at least Gazan conflict, returning the hostages and everything. More generally, I mean, if you put back on your political hat for a second, what do you think, Trump's prospects are? Just looking at pew polls, a majority of Israelis obviously, in some ways support Trump and wanted Trump to win the election. The numbers are actually flipped when it's the American Jewish community, even though Trump did get more support than he got either 8 years ago, 4 years ago. But what do you think are the, how, or do you think Trump is going to change the situation just in terms of, the wider Middle East in the coming years?
So, in 2016, when there was the inauguration of the President of the United States, President Trump, I was actually invited to DC, and I was there. And I remember his speech very, very vividly. And I think the most repeated term that he used was America first. Now, most Israelis didn't hear that. Most Israelis only heard the lines that he said in support of the state of Israel. And I think in Israel, sometimes we forget that President Trump was elected to become the president of the United States. And he's got burning issues within the United States, or which are on the agenda of the United States. And I think because he now only has one term, it's not one term leading up to a second term, and he would like to leave his legacy, he's going to try and make the biggest impact that the American people will realize that he really put America first. Obviously, it has to do also with some of American interests in the Middle East, in China, with Iran. Last term, I found him, I found his administration, I found his people who came and looked through the eyes of business people, trying to close deals, understanding that you have to move forward, not lean on history, on bad blood that was between different parts, and trying to move forward. I think it is a bit hard to predict how President Trump will actually act in specific topics. I think the issue of America first is definitely going to be on his agenda, on his charter, on his mission. As an Israeli, bearing in mind some of the hard time that the Biden administration gave us, I think we can understand why Israelis were more in support of President Trump than President Biden. But we have to be fair and honest. President Biden also helped Israel, also assisted in things that Israel never received assistance in the past. But when you put one against the other, most Israelis preferred the attitude taken by President Trump, and I think we know why.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'm sure Hillel Fold, but I actually had Hillel Fold on the podcast before the American election. I was doing a series on who should Jews vote for. So I had somebody come and support Harris, and then Hillel Fold was the pro-Trump person, and I sort of debated with each of them in turn. So that was a lot of fun. I think for listeners that want that a lot more explicitly spelled out than you just did, you can go listen to that podcast. The other question is in terms of Israeli politics, just to set the scene for listeners, even pre-October 7th, Israeli politics was in turmoil over the judicial reform. I mean, I remember, I was also in Israel over that summer, and, even, there were op-eds, and again, these were American op-eds mostly, but they were even talking about Israel maybe being on the brink of civil war. It seemed a little bit exaggerated and hyperbolic at the time, but Israeli society was obviously torn in half over this judicial reform bill. Obviously, the current Israeli administration is made up of the most right-wing people in Israel's history, people like Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir. Regardless of what you think of those aside, it seems like, post-October 7th, there was a couple months of unity, and then obviously that, respawn those two sides, obviously not about the judicial reform, but now about this idea of either do you continue the war, do you focus more on the hostages? Obviously, it's not necessarily a binary, but just generally that's where both camps are staked out on. What do you see for, I guess, the future of, civility within Israel? Because it seems like, politics, I mean, obviously there's been other times in, Israel's history. It's not like, the 1940s before 48, everybody was singing Kumbaya in, the Zionist camp. Listeners can do a historic deep dive there. But, what do you think is going to happen over the next couple of years with, trust in the government and the current government and, Bibi Netanyahu and all of that?
I think if we want to be fair and honest, Israel is not suffering from a unique situation. If you examine the American political system, if you examine the British political system, if you examine the Greek political system, if you examine the German political system, if you examine the French political system, you see that all these democracies are struggling to maintain the democratic political system as we knew it in the past. With social media, people have become much more powerful with the ability of expressing their views, in jeopardizing policy suggested by the government. We can go back to COVID and see the whole argument that was with the vaccines, without the vaccines. And, it's views that in the past you wouldn't have heard unless you were an owner of a newspaper or an owner of a TV channel. These days, anybody who has an opinion can express it and it can be spread out through the whole world. And leaders are having a harder and harder challenge to manage their governments. And I think that's what we're seeing in Israel. That's what we saw in the United States and all the other countries that I mentioned. And I think it's going to be an interesting time to see where democracy goes from here. I mean, England, they went to rounds for elections almost like Israel. And, it's a completely different political system. There you have constituencies and you have representatives according to geographical regions. And it's not like in Israel. And you see that all these systems are not managing really to govern and create policy. And I can't predict where democracy is going, but there are going to be changes that we're going to live through, and it will be a fascinating time to see where it takes us.
Yes, 100%. Well, I really appreciate your time. I know it's getting late in Israel. Is there anything else we didn't discuss that you just wanted to throw out there?
No, I just think that we would love to see all of you in Israel rather sooner than later. You will find a country that was hit, but the level of resilience of the population is absolutely shocking. I had a friend coming from the United States, and she was speaking to me by phone while she was on the beach in Tel Aviv, and she said, "Listen, I see here youngsters playing volleyball, and it's just unbelievable that you think that this country is at war whilst people play volleyball at the beach. Life is carrying on. People here are strong, and to see you will make us even stronger. And we are waiting to see you here in the Holy Land."
Amazing. Well, now I know next time I bring students, I can find you either in Efrat or at the museum in Tel Aviv. So I'll definitely plan accordingly. Oded, thank you so much.
Thank you. All the best.